Good to be back in Washington, even on such a gloomy day, and especially good to be here in this magnificent reminder of a strong and capable federal government. I'd like to begin not with a pithy, penetrating insight about the subject of our symposium, but rather with an old and hackneyed expression, one that is nonetheless very relevant for us today. And that expression is, of course, the apple falls not far from the tree. The apple, of course, is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., perhaps the most accomplished placemaker in American history, and a man who had both the great fortune as well as the great burden of being the son of perhaps the most accomplished placemaker in American history. This calls to mind another tree reference, one that I'll apply in the inverse. Donald Culross Peattie once wrote that, and I quote, "If you wish to be remembered for something you do it under an elm tree." There were, of course, at the time, still hundreds of memorial elms and memory trees in New England and elsewhere in the United States then, when he wrote that. Most famously, the Washington elm in Cambridge. Yet if the Olmstead experience is any guide, falling apples might do well, if they wish to be remembered, to roll as quickly as possible away from outstretched limbs, paternal or maternal, as the case may be. Rick Olmstead, as he was known by intimates, and as I'll call him today, had the double jeopardy of following in the professional footsteps of a famous dad and sharing his name. As he got older, Olmstead Sr. became somewhat obsessed with passing on his vast legacy. He did an exceptional job grooming Rick for a career in landscape architecture, whether or not the young man really wanted that. And if the elder Olmstead indulged in a bit of narcissism by naming his son after himself, it did in fact bring him an erstwhile sort of immortality. For Rick Olmstead's own extraordinary accomplishments would long be clouded by, confused with, and even fused to those of his fathers. As Susan Klaus has put it, the achievements of Olmsted Jr. and Sr. have become, and I quote, intertwined, with the sons somehow melded into those of the father, or at best seen as a continuation of paternal accomplishments rather than standing on their own merit. Today's symposium is all about shedding light on the long and rich career of Rick Olmstead, nudging that fallen apple out of its goodly pool of shade. What I'll do to start us off is first consider Olmsted's vital role as a bridge across sharply divergent periods in the history of American landscape architecture, each with contrasting philosophies and often antagonistic conceptions about the role and purpose of landscape in society. And secondly, I'll talk about Olmsted's ideas about city planning and examine his crucial role in launching the urban planning profession in the United States. Lewis Sullivan famously lamented that the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, with its wholesale import of wedding cake neoclassicism, set American architecture back 50 years. Local Chicago school innovators like himself, who looked to the American scene for inspiration, were shunted aside in favor of an elite group of East Coast designers trained for the most part at the École des Beaux-Arts, rounded up and herded west by Daniel Burnham. But at least the ensuing City Beautiful movement espoused a certain civic idealism. It was assumed by the cognoscenti that gazing at all that gleaming white architecture, all those perfectly aligned cornices, such as we have all around us here in Washington, too, would turn the immigrant huddled masses yearning to breathe free into virtuous Americans. Never mind, of course, that it was mostly all ripped off from long-dead Italians and just a mix of plaster and straw anyway. I say at least because the concomitant development in landscape architecture during this so-called American Renaissance, what came to be known as the country place era, was wholly bereft of social mission. With vast wealth accumulated in an era before income tax, the merchant princes of the Gilded Age and Roaring Twenties spent fortunes on faux Renaissance palazzi and gardens to set them in, guided and coached by best-selling books like Edith Wharton's Italian Gardens of the Renaissance. Landscape architects were suddenly in demand as social register clients vied with one another to create ever more resplendent estates. But within the profession, there was considerable resistance to this turn toward Italianate formalism, and especially the retreat it spelled from the tradition of public works and progressive reform that had been really at the core of the profession since its founding by the elder Olmsted. The landscape profession was soon riven by a nasty ideological war, what architectural record called, and I quote, the hot fight between the advocates of the formal and the so-called natural garden. Each side claimed an institutional base and even a city. The Olmstedians had Boston and Harvard, the country placers, New York and Cornell. Despite the power and prestige of the former, the New Yorkers prevailed, led largely by the well-born Florentine landscape architect Ferruccio Vitale. By the 1920s, the profession had almost wholly abandoned its progressive roots. The Anglo-picturesque tradition, the aesthetic favored by Olmsted Sr., had become passé, and virtually no important designer in the country was engaged in sustained, substantial public work. The great exception here was, of course, Rick Olmsted, who had both the temperament and the pedigree to command the respect of both sides in this fight. He literally brokered peace between the warring camps on one occasion, at least one occasion, and in his practice, he not only kept alive the profession's flame of public service through this long, dry country place era, but effectively passed that flame on to a new generation of designers. One of Rick Olmsted's finest landscapes and a personal favorite of mine is Fort Tryon Park in New York. Lewis Mumford enthused about this place, writing, "I know no landscape near a big city that takes the breath away more completely." And for any of you that have been there, you know that that is in fact true. Fort Tryon is itself both a hybrid work and a bridge between eras. It began literally as a country place. It was the old C.K.G. Billings estate, which you can see on the upper left there. Later acquired by that captain of captains of industry, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller hired Olmsted to improve the site in 1927, and of course later moves an entire medieval cloister there set on the park's highest hill. What Olmsted creates at Fort Tryon is a languid, naturalistic landscape packed with terrain-taming architectonics of the sort that we usually associate with more formal modes of spatial design. Soaring arches, loggias, staircases, terraces, platforms that enable these breathtaking views of the Hudson River, as you see here, and that, of course, entice the occasional yoga extremist. And though it was developed in the 1920s and later gifted to the city, I think of Fort Tryon as New York's last great romantic park of the 19th century, the 19th century progressive tradition of park design, and its first great public landscape of the New Deal era. In fact, it was completed by the city of New York in the first year of the Robert Moses tenure as commissioner of the New York City Parks Department. And this is a subject that I'll touch back on again in a moment. Rick Olmsted was a bridge of another sort from his father's Victorian age to this promising new era of public work. For Olmsted helped mentor leaders of that generation of landscape architects who would lead the profession out of the mercenary country place years and restore its tradition of progressive idealism during the 1930s and beyond. Two such men were Ralph Griswold and Norman Newton, whom Olmsted mentored from afar as each took up residency as fellows at the American Academy in Rome. Both of these men would go on to long careers in public service and in academia as well, in the case of Newton. Newton worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Park Service, where he restored the grounds of Bedloes Island in 1937, where the Statue of Liberty stands. He planned the Saratoga Battlefield and the Salem Maritime National Historic Parks. Griswold spent most of his career in Pittsburgh. He developed, with Stein and Wright, he worked on Chatham Village and was instrumental in developing Point State Park in Pittsburgh, which really became the crown jewel of the 1950s, 1960s Pittsburgh Renaissance. Olmsted had also earlier played a formative role in nurturing the gifted but somewhat star-crossed Edward Lawson while he was in Rome. Lawson, whom you see here in his studio at the American Academy, was the first fellow to receive the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture, which Olmsted and Vitale had actually teamed up to establish in 1914. Lawson was a Buffalo kid from the wrong side of the tracks, who nonetheless led his class at Cornell and beat two Harvard graduates for this inaugural Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture. This so outraged James Sturgis Pray, the somewhat pompous head of the Harvard program at the time, that he nearly destroyed Lawson's career. Vitale defended Lawson with matching vigor and vitriol, and poor Ed Lawson, of course, was caught in really what became a very vicious firefight. It was Rick Olmsted who not only brokered a ceasefire between Pray and Vitale here, but took over mentorship of the much shaken Edward Lawson, who was also dragged into World War I during his fellowship. In his letters, in Olmsted's letters to Lawson, he provides thoughtful, measured feedback on Lawson's work, encouraging the young man with tact and grace, where James Sturgis Pray had really only badgered him. Olmsted later set down a philosophy of mentorship, a charter of sorts, for both advisor and advisee, and it was titled Relations of the Fellow to His Advisor. You may or may not be able to read the title there on the left. And this was a document that was used for many years at the American Academy in Rome. Olmsted's rescue of Lawson bore especially rich dividends. For as a professor himself later at Cornell, Lawson helped send so many students to the American Academy that its Landscape Architecture Fellowship came to be known as the Cornell Prize. The most extraordinary of these was a young man by the name of Michael Rapuano, who eventually teamed up with a classmate or a fellow alum, Gilmore D. Clark, to found an office, Clark and Rapuano, that over the next 40 years or so, 45 years, would, I think, most fully embody the Olmsted legacy of public works and civic responsibility, amplifying and extending that legacy well into the second half of the 20th century. In the 1930s in Westchester County, New York, and right here across the river in Virginia, Clark and Rapuano create really the world's first modern highways, the first motor parkways, and use these roads to create a vast system of parks and parkways, really the first regional landscape of the motor age, and you could do the first park system of the motor age, and you could see a wonderful watercolor map of that system on the left there. This was really the Olmsted Park on wheels, right? The bounded, sort of contained sanctuary of Central Park, drawn out now along these green pastoral corridors, these rustic corridors of the parkways, to embrace an entire metropolitan region. And this Westchester model, as it comes to be known, had influence around the world, and most of all, I would say, in New York State and the New York metropolitan area, where it becomes the model that Robert Moses uses for his wholesale transformation of metropolitan New York beginning in the 1930s. And it was in this way that Olmsted's steady mentorship of the Rome Fellows came back home. In 1934, Moses appointed Gilmore Clark chief consultant to the New York City Parks Department, and Rapuano heads up the very influential, very innovative landscape design division of the Parks Department. With Moses, Clark and Rapuano modernized several 19th century Olmsted landscapes, I would say most dramatically Riverside Park, which you see a watercolor rendering of here. That's the 79th Street traffic circle and boat basin there. They also brought Rick Olmsted's Fort Tryon plan to completion in time for the park's opening in October 1935. Rapuano personally was responsible for laying out many of the paths and in Fort Tryon, executing the details for many of the terraces and overlooks, and especially designing this playground here, which, as many of you may know, is actually just to the just on the east side of the entrance of the park. Gilmore Clark was also Rick Olmsted's heir apparent as a city planner and planning educator, serving like Olmsted on the National Commission of Fine Arts, headquartered upstairs, but quiet today, I'm sure, and founding my own Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell in 1935. Olmsted taught some of the very first city planning courses in the United States at Harvard some years earlier, and would go on to play a seminal role in establishing this youngest and I would say most ambitious of the American placemaking professions. As with so much of his work, Olmsted's achievements here, too, have been largely overlooked. Yet, as John Reps has put it, Olmsted was, and I quote, arguably the intellectual leader of the American city planning movement in the early 20th century. Rick Olmsted's planning debut took place right here in Washington, D.C. at the tender age of 30. when Olmsted was invited to serve on the Macmillan Commission, along with that trinity of talent that created the Columbian Exposition some years earlier. Burnham, Charles Follen McKim, Augustus St. Gaudens. The Macmillan Plan was perhaps the finest achievement of the City Beautiful era, and it was Olmsted who was largely responsible for the plan's most progressive elements, including a proposal for a matrix of parks and parkways throughout the capital. Olmsted would work mightily over the next 20 years to bring to the nascent field of city planning professional legitimacy and a strong theoretical and philosophical base. Perhaps most importantly, Olmsted understood well the inherent complexity of the planning enterprise, what he described as, and I quote, the appalling breadth and ramification of real city planning. At the time, much of what passed for planning in the United States was really just City Beautiful icing on gritty industrial cake. Little attention was paid the vital systems that make real cities tick: economics, demographics, the flows of people and goods and information. Olmsted cautioned that interventions made without scrutiny of these varied lines of activity, as he called them, could trigger an avalanche of unanticipated problems. We are dealing here, he wrote in an address to the Second National Congress or Conference on City Planning in 1910, with the play of enormously complex forces which no one clearly understands, and our efforts to control them so often lead to unexpected and deplorable results that sober-minded people are often tempted to give up. Minimizing unanticipated consequences obviously meant thoroughly understanding the city's constituent systems, and this required broadening the scope of planning expertise beyond the merely aesthetic or architectonic. Olmsted argued that subdivisions of the field, as he put it, would be necessary, each making, and I quote, substantial advances through better knowledge of facts, clearer definition of purpose, and improvements in technique. Olmsted was also, oh, this is out of place, sorry. Olmsted was also well ahead of his contemporaries in recognizing that a truly visionary plan was a living document, that planning should not be a one-off exercise or a one-act play, but rather an evolutionary process, a continuous and permanent function, as he put it, and not a thing to be done in spasm once and for all. This meant that almost by definition, a truly comprehensive plan could not possibly be prepared by an expert consultant in town for a week. And Olmsted included himself, first and foremost, in denouncing this waiting for Superman approach. Instead, he argued that planning had to be institutionalized. As an ongoing concern, he wrote in 1913, fully established in the framework of municipal government, accepted and supported by public opinion as firmly as the public school system or the fire department. But while Olmsted favored the use of a permanent administrative officer of the necessary technical ability, as he put it, to manage the plan itself, he counseled that planning activity not be confined to a specific department, but instead distributed across the branches of municipal governance so that thinking long-term and big picture informed all decisions about the city's future. He would have deplored the all-too-common rule-bound planning bureau, isolated in City Hall and wrapped up in red tape. To use an IT analogy here, he was against the standalone planning app and instead for a kind of ubiquitous or cloud approach to thinking about our urban futures. In the end, Olmsted's vision of planning in America was one of sane, level-headed humility in the face of the city's breathtaking scale and complexity. There were times when even he came to doubt whether any one profession could ever hope to master the many arts, sciences, and magic of city making, that planning risked becoming what many feel it is today, a kind of jack of all trades, master of none. He might well agree that the profession has become too conscious of complexity, too eager to please every stakeholder, that it has sacrificed speculative courage for mere consensus, in the process losing its moxie and even its street cred. And in this era of rapid global urbanization, when the skills and insights of planners are needed more than ever, this is hardly something that we can afford. As I put it myself in a somewhat notorious essay 2 years ago that Tim Manell will remember well, planning has become, and I quoting myself now, it's always a bad sign, a caretaker profession, reactive rather than proactive, corrective instead of preemptive, rule-bound and hamstrung in anything but visionary. Like his father before him, Rick Olmsted made big plans, but they were realistic plans, tempered by modesty and trimmed of that pretense of infallibility, as he called it, that made for good press, but nearly always caused problems. Olmsted had both the wisdom and common sense not to confuse the stirring of men's blood with the making of good cities, and for that alone we owe him a great debt. Thank you.